Today we're going to talk about empire. But forget what you know about kings and queens and massive state-run armies. No, this is a story about how a business, a private company, grew so powerful that it built its own empire for profit. And in doing so, well, it changed the world forever.
So here's the question at the heart of it all. It almost sounds like a riddle, doesn't it? How could one company, operating out of a small office in London, manage to topple the mighty Mughal Empire, which had ruled India for centuries? I mean, how on earth does something like that even happen?
And this quote just captures the sheer absurdity of it perfectly. For most of its existence, the East India Company's main headquarters was this unassuming building in London, just 5 windows wide. And yet, from that tiny little spot, it somehow managed to project enough power to take over one of the richest, most powerful empires on the planet.
To really understand how wild this is, you have to look at the money. Around 1750, Mughal India was an absolute economic titan. We're talking about almost 40% of the entire world's GDP. England, by comparison, a tiny little sliver of that. So this wasn't a case of some rich, powerful nation conquering a poorer one. This was a single corporation from a much, much smaller economy, overthrowing a global superpower.
Okay, so how did they pull it off? How did they manage this impossible conquest? Well, it all started with a radical new idea back in London.
And that idea was the joint stock company. See, before this, big overseas ventures were usually run by the state, by kings and governments. But this was totally different. It was an innovation that let regular people pool their money together, invest in a project, and then share in the profits, or, the losses. It basically privatized the business of empire building.
And get this, who were the people buying in? It wasn't just wealthy lords. The original investor list for the East India Company had the Lord Mayor of London right alongside haberdashers, winemakers, even leather workers. For the very first time, if you had a little extra cash lying around, you could literally buy a share in an overseas adventure, all for the hope of a massive payday. So what you get is a totally new kind of empire. The old way was slow, state-funded, and tangled up in bureaucracy. But this new way, the one the East India Company perfected, it was privately funded, which meant it was laser-focused on profit. And because of that, it was incredibly aggressive, nimble, and willing to take huge risks a government would never dream of.
So you have this powerful financial tool in London. How exactly did that turn into a weapon of conquest on the ground in India? Let's break it down.
The company's playbook was just audacious. Instead of shipping everything they needed from Britain, they figured out how to use local resources to conquer the locals. So they'd borrow huge sums of money from Indian bankers to fund their armies, and who made up those armies? Mostly local Indian soldiers called sepoys, who were trained and paid by the company. Then they'd exploit all the existing rivalries between local rulers, conquer a new piece of territory, and use the tax money from that land to do it all over again. It was this brutally efficient, self-funding machine of conquest.
And here's a number that will just blow your mind. At the time of the Battle of Plassey, the battle that really sealed the company's control over Bengal, there were only about 200 British officials in the entire region. 200, ruling over millions and millions of people. It's a staggering thought, and it just shows how completely they relied on that playbook of using local money and local soldiers to do their work.
And if one person embodied this whole ruthless strategy, it was Robert Clive. He started out as this troubled kid who was sent to India, basically to get him out of the way, and he found his true calling in the company's private army. He had no patience for the old gentlemanly rules of war. He'd attack at night, in the middle of a thunderstorm, from behind. He mastered the playbook and terrified his opponents by doing everything you weren't supposed to do.
After a major victory, Clive literally walked into the Bengal treasury and just started stuffing his pockets. Later, when he was hauled in front of Parliament to explain the enormous fortune he'd brought back, this was his actual response. He wasn't sorry. He said he was astonished at his own moderation, basically saying he could have taken way more. The audacity is just on another level.
Now, the East India Company's success did more than just make its investors rich. It created a terrifyingly effective blueprint for conquest. Other European nations saw what a private company could do, and in the late 1800s, they took those same lessons, leveraging technology, exploiting local divisions, and applied them to an entire continent.
And just look at how fast it happened. In 1870, about 90% of Africa was self-governed. Fast forward just a little over 40 years to the start of World War I, and that number is completely flipped. Now, 90% was colonized by European powers. It was this incredibly rapid, frantic land grab that we now call the scramble for Africa.
This whole period was just defined by this intense competition. Things really kicked off at the Berlin Conference in 1884.
where European leaders literally sat around a map and drew up the rules for how they were going to carve up the continent. But it wasn't all one-sided. You had moments of incredible resistance, like in 1896 when Ethiopia won a shocking victory over Italy at the Battle of Adwa. And the competition got so fierce it almost led to war between the colonizers themselves, like the Fashoda incident, where Britain and France nearly came to blows over a tiny fort in the middle of Sudan.
So the most important rule to come out of that Berlin conference was something called the principle of effective occupation. Basically, you couldn't just plant a flag and say, "This is mine" anymore. You had to prove you actually controlled the territory with soldiers and administrators on the ground. And that one rule, it was like firing a starting gun on a mad dash to claim as much land as physically possible as fast as possible.
So what made this lightning-fast conquest even possible? Well, it really came down to technology. Three things in particular gave the Europeans a massive, almost unfair advantage. First, the medicine quinine, which helped them survive malaria. Second, steamships, which let them travel deep into the heart of the continent on rivers. And third, the most decisive tool of all, the Maxim gun, one of the first machine guns, which gave small European armies devastating firepower.
So what's the legacy of this whole era? An era that started with one company's ambition in India and ended with a continent being carved up. Well, in short, a world redrawn.
The final result of all this was a map of Africa that made absolutely no sense to the people who actually lived there. It was drawn by diplomats in Europe to serve their own economic interests. They drew straight lines across deserts and through mountains, completely ignoring thousands of years of history, culture, and geography. Entire communities were split in two, and ancient rivals were suddenly forced to live together inside these new, artificial colonial states.
And that brings us to our final thought, because this isn't just ancient history. The legacy of those borders, drawn so arbitrarily for European convenience, is still with us today. It leaves us with a really important question to think about. How many of the conflicts and instabilities we see in the world right now are really just echoes of lines drawn on a map in a room in Berlin all those years ago?